everybody. Today we're going to talk about the Toronto Blue Jays, the choking dog of a franchise that came out with high expectations and has been a last place team ever since day one. Let's start with predictions from the beginning of the season that I had on Twitter. You can follow me at astock3. I said this would be a second place team, but I said it wouldn't be a playoff team. I thought that the teams out in the West, Oakland, Texas, and Anaheim, would all find ways into the playoffs, due in a large part to the fact that the horrible Houston Astros were joining the division, and the Seattle Mariners are not good, so they'd be beating up on those teams and getting the wins. Now let's move on to... Now, at the beginning of the year, I also picked the Rays for division champion, and right now they're game out, so we can see how that's going. I thought that they had the best pitching in maybe all of baseball, and really when you can consider the Jays rotation, compare the Jays rotation to the Rays rotation, you have to think that Price, Moore, Hellickson, Archer, all four of them are better than the top starter on the Jays. So it's ridiculous when people are saying that the Jays had a good rotation, because Jeff Niemann would be about what, the third starter on the Jays almost if he was healthy. And now let's back up to the beginning, to the off season, way back in January when the Jays started building up their hype. It was built around two trades. The first one with the Miami Marlins, a blockbuster that sent half Miami's roster to Toronto. The Jays got Josh Johnson, Mark Burley, Jose Reyes, Emilio Bonifacio, John Buck. All those guys came to Toronto for some of your top prospects. You sent one of the Lansing three, Justin Nicolino, to the Marlins. You sent Jake Marisnick. You sent Edenia Hechavarria, Yunel Escobar, just to name a few, along with a couple other low-level minor leaguers. And in that trade, you added about $30 million in payroll a year, roughly, maybe a bit more. We'll get into what you're getting from those guys a little bit later. But then you had the second trade, which sent Noah Syndergaard and Travis Denard to the Mets for reigning NL Cy Young winner R.A. Dickey. Now, this is a trade that I was fundamentally against at the beginning of the time because R.A. Dickey's 38. You're not going to get better as a 38-year-old. It doesn't matter if you had a career year. You're never going to improve. You're always going to be on the downside. The best you can hope to do is the same level. And the odds of that happening are really low at 38. You're just going to go on a decline. And in that, you gave up the best member of the Lansing three from last year, Noah Syndergaard. He's a big, strong Texas kid. And you gave up the top catching prospect in all of baseball, Travis Denard. Yes, he's got some injury problems, but wouldn't you rather take a chance on him than what you have now? And then we're going to look at the free agent left fielder. They signed Melky Cabrera to a 2-year, $16 million deal. Absolutely ridiculous. Cabrera was coming off a 50 games drug suspension for taking testosterone, and he was having a career year, All-Star Game MVP. He was hitting ridiculous over 300, leading the NL. And really, you're signing a guy for $16 million, 2-year contract for a guy who just came off a drug suspension? Who else is giving him that money? That's ridiculous. He should be lucky to get half of that on a 1-year deal. Just crazy money. Now let's move to what's happened so far in the season. The Jays have used 15 different starting pitchers. I'll name them for you, and we can see what you guys think about these guys. First, you have R.A. Dickey. Again, he's pitching where he should be for a 38-year-old, and that's slightly better than Tim Wakefield did for the Red Sox. And that's all you should have expected in that trade. That was a horrible trade. I was against that from day one too. You can go back and look at my Twitter if you go through it, get back to whenever that happened. Next is Josh Johnson. He came in, they traded for him. He had 1 year left before his free agent year. It's a short-term trade with the Miami Marlins, and it's horrible because Johnson, even if he's basically A.J. Burnett 2.0, and that's a big, talented pitcher who throws hard but is injury prone. He's very talented, but it's not showing this year. His ERA is over 6. He's been god-awful. He's getting about 5 innings a start. That's pathetic. You move into another version of A.J. Burnett, and that's Brandon Morrow, a very talented, highly drafted, highly heralded starter out of the Washington area, from Seattle, and he was a California pitcher. And he was very good last year, but he's tailed off this year. Then he got hurt. He's out for pretty much the rest of the year. And talking about pitchers who got hurt at the end of last year, and the team had no one to blame but themselves for his basically the self-destruction of his career, was Ricky Romero. He was forced to pitch out the rest of last season, even though he needed elbow surgery in the offseason. The Jays last year were going nowhere. There was no need to waste his arm, and you could see it by the end of the season. His release point was noticeably lower than before, and he really hasn't recovered since. The Jays have no one to blame but themselves. It's ridiculous. Talk about arm injuries this team has had. You talk about 2 stars from last year. Kyle Drabek blew out his UCL and required Tommy John in June. I was at that start. You heard that pop. It was bad, but he still isn't. He's pitched about 25 innings in the minors so far. He should be close to return, but because of the poor Jays medical staff, he's still in the minors, just working his way up to AAA now. And then you have Drew Hutchison, who strained his elbow but required surgery. They had to put it off a couple months, see if he could rehab it. That didn't work, so he needed a Tommy John surgery. Now we're going to look at, last year they made a ridiculous trade too, and that was acquiring J.A. Happ, Brandon Lyon, a bunch of other, well, pretty much bums for some prospects that they didn't like Asher Wojnarowski. He was a compensation sandwich pick a couple years ago, and the Jays gave up on him saying he wasn't a top-line starter. Well, if he's not a top-line starter and you drafted him that high, shouldn't that be questioning your scouting department? Why would you draft a guy if he wasn't that good? These are the things that Alex Anthopoulos does that don't make sense. He talks a big game and sounds intelligent, but he does a lot of stupid things. And we're going to get into that later when he made a very stupid assumption. Now let's move over to let's actually stay on J.A. Happ for a second. Anthopoulos thought this was a highly touted, he was highly touted with the Phillies a few years ago before he was traded for Roy Oswalt. But that was his only good season. He's been garbage since. He's been replacement level. He's 5th starter material that you've seen to extension for nearly $7 million over 2 years. That's ridiculous. He should belong in the bullpen. That's what he should be. He should be a lefty in the bullpen. Let's move to Esmil Rogers, a guy who they acquired through the John Farrell trade when they got Mike Aviles, who they then flipped to Cleveland for Esmil Rogers. He was excellent for the first half of the season for a guy who was a fringe player to make the roster, and he turned into a decent starter. But then he imploded. Teams were able to figure him out on the second, third time seeing him. The sinker ball isn't working for him anymore, and he was told he wasn't going to start anymore. But then, Josh Johnson going on the DL, he's back starting 3 days after they tell him that. Just a mess of that roster. Then here are some of the replacement starter. Excuse me, I forgot one. Mark Burley. He was expected to be the 5th starter. I wonder who made that prediction. Maybe it was some Rogers stooge who just loves kissing the ass of the team. And they thought he'd be a 5th starter. Well, no. This is a guy who's been a good pitcher his entire career, but he's up there in age. This is part of the trade that made the Miami trade ridiculous. Mark Burley is owed $18 million for each of not this year, but next year and the year following. That is ridiculous for a player his age. Miami won that trade from day one because they just shed $200 million in salary like that. It was ridiculous. Burley is just going to decline like R.A. Dickey and just going to get worse. He is going to be a 5th starter next year, and you're going to be calling that one of the worst contracts on the Jays in the next 2 years. Now let's look at the replacement starters they've had. Now they had former first-round pick Chad Jenkins. He's shown some promise. Needs a little bit more seasoning. Next year, he could have a role on the team, maybe out of the bullpen. And then you've had Redmond, who's come up and pitched well, but like Rogers, you know this is a guy who's going to be figured out and is going to be shown for what he is, and that's a fringe major league starter. They went to the rotting corpses of Ramon Ortiz and Chin Ming Wong. Yes, those guys who don't belong in the major leagues have been long since considered career overs, and guys just been taking flyers on them, and they've never panned out. It's a waste of time and money. And the number 15, Sean Nolan, a guy who somehow made his way up to the roster and has never performed. He's not a good pitcher. He's not even that good at Double-A. He's not going to be a guy who's ever going to make it on a major league team. Let's move to the bullpen, where they have great numbers. But that's mostly because they're pitching a ridiculous amount of innings and manager John Givens has burned them out, as you can see now, when they're just giving up runs and going on the DL. Casey Janssen has always been a good pitcher for the Jays. Even when a starter, he was decent. Moved to the bullpen, and he found his natural role, and he's been good as a closer. Maybe a guy they should have looked to move at the trade deadline, as he's not a great guy, but he is above average. We look at their two setup men, both all-stars this year. Steve Drabek, acquired in maybe Alex Anthopoulos' best trade for Eric Thames, who the Mariners DFA'd and is now in the Orioles organization. And Brett Cecil, one of the heralded 2007 draft picks, one of the 2 of the 7 that they had in the first, I believe, was 60 picks that panned out. The rest have been a bunch of bums that failed to make it above Double A, and for some guys failed to make it above High A in Dunedin. Both all-stars, both really hitting their innings peak right about now, which is not acceptable. And then you have Sergio Santos, who since day one, since he's been here, he's been hurt. And that's very unfortunate because he's a great power arm when healthy. The converted shortstop that the Jays originally acquired in the Troy Gloss trade, it's a trade you should do every time because he's signed to a cheap contract for what he can be. He could be the best relief pitcher the Jays have if he can stay healthy. He was great for Chicago a couple years ago when he saved over 30 games. We move now to really the guys that have just been the eating innings earlier in games, coming in the 6th and 7th when they are forced to. Starting with Aaron Loup, who's been excellent since he's been called up. Dustin McGowan, the most injury-prone pitcher in Jays history since the turn of the millennium. He was once typed as the 1B to Roy Halladay, and we saw how that worked out. He came to a near no-hitter against the Colorado Rockies, and then had just about every part of his arm fall apart, and then he had his knee blowout. And then they were reluctant to just move him to the bullpen where he would be pitching less frequently and throwing less pitches each day. But no, let's try him as a starter, and he of course gets hurt. Then we move into Darren Oliver, a guy who's a good loogie, lefty-only specialist, who for some blatant unknown reason they didn't trade at the deadline when there's always a market for these guys to get something back in return. You don't need to be carrying his salary. You don't need a guy like this in the bullpen. Trade him to a contender. Get him a chance at the playoffs. Don't force him to stay around on your garbage team. Then you have Neil Wagner, who's been good. The Buffalo AAA closer. When he's come to Toronto, he's been very good. Brad Lincoln, acquired at the trade deadline last year for Travis Snyder, he started poorly, but he's consistently getting better. And Juan Perez has been good. Now let's move to the lineup, which was heralded as an exciting lineup moving into the year. You were supposed to have Jose Reyes leading off and playing shortstop. He's been great when healthy, but he missed a big portion of the middle of the season with a sprained ankle when he was slid into second base. When Reyes was hurt, they turned to Minoru Kawasaki, who's been a fan favorite for just his antics on the field. And it's weird how Toronto always embraces the players who aren't very good. Toronto is a loser sports city that embraces bad play and bad players. Why don't they embrace a superstar like, they don't have any really on this team. Maybe that's why they don't. And we look at second base, where Alex Anthopoulos made the assumption that jack of all trades, Emilio Bonifacio, if he was focusing on one position, could be good at one position defensively, and he isn't, and he's never been an overly great batter. I mean, this isn't a guy who gets on 400 clip, not even close. He's just a fast guy who can steal some bases. Basically, he's Rajai Davis, maybe a little worse. And you already have that. You don't need 2 Rajai Davises on your team. And we look at his other signing in the offseason, a 3-year, $9 million contract for Macier Asturias, which is a little ridiculous because he's not a starting caliber guy. And he never was. Sure, it's great. He can play every position in the infield. He's versatile, but he's not a good hitter. And what's the point in paying $9 million for a guy like that? We move to first base, where they have, and DH, where they have the combo of Adam Lind and Edwin Encarnacion. Now, if you want to go back a couple of years on my Twitter, you can go find that I predicted that Edwin Encarnacion would be a David Ortiz-like player when they moved him to full-time DH or first base. Now, of course, I'm sounding good with all these predictions. You're probably wondering, you're just saying that now. Well, yeah, well, I'll give you a bad one I had. I said JP would be a 300-game winner back in 2004, and we've seen how that turned out. He's never going to come close. Maybe he won't even come close to 200 wins. So Adam Lynn was great for the first half of the year, but July tailed off. He's back hitting 280 after starting the year around 330. And Encarnacion's over 30 home runs again. He signed to a great contract at 3 years, $27 million. And backing them up as the utility infielder, a guy who's just old and there for leadership, but not a good player, is Mark DeRosa. And really, what's the point in signing a guy like that? Why don't you sign someone who adds more to the team than that? We go across the diamond to third base, where the young Canadian, well, heralded as a superstar, but has yet to prove that he is, Brett Laurie. He's been more of a player who plays like a hothead on cocaine, who's out of control most of the time, has a high temper, and his play doesn't excuse his actions on the field. He plays like a maniac and isn't under control. He needs help mentally before he can excel as a player. Now we move behind the plate, where really you can get a pass on Josh Toll as a personal catcher. Big deal. He's going to catch 105 games. The problem is J.P. Arencibia. This guy is never gonna be good. It was ridiculous to think that his average would jump 50 points like people were predicting. Now what a joke! Just because he did it in AAA, going from a 220 hit to a 300 hit, or whatever he did his second year in AAA, that was a joke. He's not a good contact hitter. He has a horrible eye. All he can do is hit for power. He can't feel his position. He's pretty much useless. Why would you want a guy like that? He can't do anything. We move to the outfield. We've already talked about Melky Cabrera and his ridiculous contract signing. Let's talk about his play on the field, which has been horrible defense, mostly because he was hurt and they refused to put him on the DL when he needed it, and extended that injury, never let it get better. So they hamstrung their own team. Yes, and he had a hamstring injury. We look at the fourth outfielder, that's Rajai Davis, who's actually had a very good season for what he is, and that is a fourth outfielder with some speed, can field well, doesn't have a great throwing arm, but can steal a lot of bases. He's stolen 30 bases for 4 or 5 straight years now. Great speed, great base runner. We look at their top prospect outfielder, Anthony Gose, who they can think is a leadoff hitter in the mold of Jose Reyes, but no, he's a guy who can throw, run, and field. He can't hit for contact, he can't hit for power if he can't hit for contact. So he's basically a Rajai Davis clone is what he's going to end up being. And that's not what you want. You trade Roy Halladay and you're basically going to get, who knows if Kyle Drabek comes back full. You're traded Travis Denard for R.A. Dickey in a trade, and you're getting 4th, 5th starter caliber out of him. And then you're going to get a 4th outfielder in Anthony Gose. Now let's move to the starter in center, and that's Colby Rasmus, acquired in a trade a few seasons ago from the White Sox and Cardinals in a 3-way deal there. Rasmus has played his best baseball since he's been in Toronto, but really you're seeing his peak. He is never going to be more than this 276 hitter, mid-20s home runs. So don't expect any more from him. This is what you're getting. You're not going to get any better. Now we move into right field, and potentially the biggest diva in all of Major League Baseball. A guy who whines and complains about everything. Well, you know what, Jose Bautista, you were a nobody before you came out and had one great season, and now you're expected to perform like a superstar? No, you should just perform like the guy you were before. And then when you hit 56, you weren't acting like a diva. Maybe if you started acting like that, you'd go back to getting the calls you want instead of whining for everything. Now let's talk about the manager. They started January with John Farrell. He was in the last year of his contract, and the Boston Red Sox had just fired Valentine. So Farrell, who was in Boston earlier as the pitching coach, wants to go back. Well, if you want him so badly, sign him to an extension. Either that or trade him back. You shouldn't be whining and complaining like the Jays people are doing. Like Mike Wilner, shut your mouth. If you want this guy so bad, sign him to an extension. He has every right to go out and seek more job security. If your contract was up at the end of the year, would you not be looking for another job? Now let's go talk about the man that replaced him, John Gibbons, the bumbling fool of tech from Texas. He was here once before, and how many player fights did we have? We had Dave Bush, who made an appearance this year in the bullpen. We had Shea Hillenbrand, and we had Ted Lilly. This is a guy that the players do not respect, and that's the main job as the manager. Command the players' respect, get them to play for you. And it's obvious that's something you cannot do. There's a reason why, John Gibbons, you have not been hired by another team, or yet have alone been interviewed for a managerial job. You are not a good manager. You are just a bum. You had basically the same talent team when you were first here, and the most you achieved was a 500 record over your tenure. That's just pathetic with the amount of talent you had. You're just Cy Young winner. Now let's move to ownership, where if people want to say that Rogers is good ownership, they should just be hitting themselves in the head, because Rogers cares about one thing, that's making money. They bought this Rogers Center for $25 million. What a bargain that was, considering it cost $500 million to make. They own the TV stations that broadcast all the games. So let's put this in perspective. The Texas Rangers make $80 million a year. The Dodgers and Angels make $100 million a deal for a local TV deal. That's local. Rogers broadcasts nationally. So yes, the state of California is about the same size as all of Canada population-wise, but considering they're making 100%, nearly 100% profit, all they have to do is the expense of the game. They should be making a couple times. They should be making roughly $100 million plus, way more than that. They should be making $250 million. $250 million. That's what they should be making for this team. They are making a killing, and that's all they care about. Rogers doesn't care about getting better. They care about money, and that's what they're going to continue to do. They are a rich ownership that could compete with payrolls with the New York Yankees and be like the New York Yankees, the best run sports team in all of baseball. We're going to talk about that later in a future video about the New York Yankees and everything they are doing right and that they should be getting credit for. But let's look forward for next year, where they're going to be the same lousy team. And here's one thing that they're probably not going to do: clean house, which tells the fans that this season is acceptable. Failure is acceptable for Rogers. They're not going to clean house. They're not going to fire Gibbons. They're not going to fire Anthopoulos like they should, because that's the type of city Toronto is. Toronto doesn't get rid of losers. They let them continue to do what they're doing. So that's what I think of the Blue Jays. There's my rant. Hopefully you enjoy it.